All right. Hello, everyone. Hope everyone can hear me. So this is now the tail end of Chapter 10, Aggregate Demand, Building ISLM. And the last time we spoke, we had, in fact, built the IS curve, right? Which is just a combination of the shape of the investment function here and the Keynesian cross, or the Y equals PE model here, both of which will generate this relationship between R and Y, for which the points on the IS curve are simply what's called the equilibrium points, or equilibrium combinations of R and Y that make up the equilibrium of the goods market, or the S equals I savings investment market, or the goods market. You should think about intuitively, it is in fact the goods market. Right? So this is the IS curve. Before we move on to the LM curve, we should think about how fiscal policy shifts the IS curve, right? So if you notice, here's the figure 10-8. The IS curve is in the R and Y space, okay? So anything that, if you shift the R around, the interest rate, then you are going to move along the IS curve, right? That's exactly akin to like the demand curve. If you change the price, you're moving along the demand curve to give you the quantity demanded. So clearly, if you change something that's not R or not Y, then it's going to shift the curve because it's simply not here, or any other variable is not here, right? So I invite you to think of all of the other variables in the S is equal to I, or the goods market equilibrium, that's not R and not Y, and then change them. So just as one example, here you have fiscal policy and an increase in G, or change in G that's positive, right? So any sort of changes in PE, of which the change in G is 1, will change your planned expenditure line. It will shift it up or shift it down. And it will change your Y. It will either make it go up like here, or it can also make it go down if the PE line shifts down. Now, if the Y, or real GDP, goes up because of this exogenous, or this change in planned expenditure, then you will see that for any given R, Y will go up, right? So for this R bar, and instead of Y1, it's going to be Y2. For any other R, it's going to also increase Y from whatever the Y is in this blue IS curve. It's going to shift it to the new Y in the IS curve. So a shift in the planned expenditure through fiscal policy here will shift the IS curve to the right. And this is a very interesting and correct bullet point here, that it will shift the IS curve to the right by exactly the change in G times the multiplier, which is 1 over MPC, because that's how much Y will change here in the Keynesian cross. Okay. So therefore, the multiplier will play a role whenever you're shifting the IS curve left and right. Okay. So that's the IS curve. Again, here, combinations of interest rate and income that are consistent with equilibrium in the market for goods and services. Let me just return here. Okay. And now we're in the second part, the money market and the LM curve. So this is the second curve in the LM model, right? The closed economy LM model. So the LM curve plots the relationship between the interest rate and the level of income. Notice it's both the same two variables, R and Y. R and Y that arises in the market for money balances, right? So in this one, instead of the market for goods and services, for which Y equals C plus I plus G is the equation, right? Whenever Y equals C plus I plus G, or whenever S is equal to I, you have the equilibrium in the goods market, right? But here, this is also a similar concept wherein we're looking at the equilibrium in the money market, okay? Which is the same thing as thinking about the market for liquidity, okay? Or the ability to purchase things, liquidity. Okay, so we will invoke or use the theory of liquidity preference, which is essentially the same as understanding the market for money balances. Okay? But the theory of liquidity preferences is going to be the main idea or concept for 10-2. So the theory of liquidity preference. In this classic work of the general theory, Keynes offered his view of how the interest rate is determined in the short run. His explanation is called the theory of liquidity preference because it posits that the interest rate adjusts to balance the supply and demand for money. Okay. So in the same way that in a demand and supply model, the price happens to equilibrate quantity demand, quantity supply, it's the same thing here, that the interest rate will equilibrate the demand and supply for money. To develop this theory, we begin with the supply of real money balances. So first, as in all demand supply models, you think about the supply curve, and then you think about the demand curve, right? So here's the supply curve, M over P, and the superscript S, that's the supply for real money balances. And here it's going to be super easy. These are just exogenous numbers, P over M over P, or M bar over P bar, right? So M is an exogenous policy variable chosen by the central bank. Okay. The price level P is also exogenous in this model. And it's fixed also in addition, right? So we take the price level as given because in the ISLM model, you explain the short run where the price level is fixed. So these assumptions imply that the supply of real money balances is fixed and in particular does not depend on the interest rate. And therefore, if this is just fixed and does not depend on the interest rate, we'll look at the graph now. If you'll notice that the supply here is a vertical line, okay, where it touches the x-axis here, which is real money balances, through its exogenous value, which is M bar over P bar, whatever that is. Okay? So that is the supply for money balances, which is exogenous variable controlled by the central bank through what's called monetary policy. Next, we consider the demand for real money balances. The theory of liquidity preference posits that the interest rate is one determinant as to how much money people choose to hold. So what the interest rate here is, it's the opportunity cost of holding money. Okay. So this should be very, very familiar if you recall back to chapter 4, because it's the same argument that the interest rate will be the opportunity cost of holding money. When the real interest rate or when the interest rate rises, people want to hold less of their wealth in the form of money. We can write the demand for real money balances as the following: M over PD, which is demand for money, which is a negative function of the real interest rate R here, right? So a little bit of an aside, we're using small r. In the earlier chapter, chapter 4, we were using the nominal interest rate I. In this particular case, in the ISLM model, because prices are fixed, inflation is fixed, and therefore, in this very special case, the nominal interest rate is the same as the real interest rate. Okay. So let's continue with the theory because we're not quite done. According to the theory of liquidity preference, the supply and demand for real money balances determines what interest rate prevails in the economy. That is, the interest rate adjusts to equilibrate the money market, right? So in this case, you've got the demand for money here, which is, as of right now, it's simplified to be purely a function of R. And then it's downward sloping because it's the price, right? R is the price for holding or demanding money. So the lower R is, the lower the price is of holding money, and therefore you want to hold more real money balances. And the opposite is true when the interest rate is high. And here you'll see a reduction in the supply of money here, and that will tend to change the interest rate R, right? That will equilibrate the money market. As you'll see, first you start in this blue line, and then you move to the new M over P, say M changed, right? And P is held constant here. What will happen is the real interest rate will rise to, again, clear the money market. In this next section, we will now include GDP because we have not yet talked about Y or GDP. So having developed the theory of liquidity preference as an explanation as how the interest rate is determined, we can now use the theory to derive the LM curve. And we ask the following question: how does a change in Y or GDP affect the market for real money balances? Okay. The answer is that the level of income also affects the demand for money, the demand for liquidity. When income is high, expenditure is high, and people engage in more transactions, that requires the use of money. Okay. And money allows you to become liquid. That's why money and liquidity are go together in this model, right? Thus greater income here implies greater money demand. So you can imagine, well, it's going to be drawn in a moment there, that here's your demand for money. An increase in Y or income will shift the demand for money out, right? Okay. So mathematically, it will help to shift it because Y is not in the X-axis. This is not Y. And it's also not in the Y-axis. It's also not here because in the Y-axis, it's R. So this is R and this is M over P. Y is not here in the market for real money balances. Therefore, if Y rises, it will increase the demand for money, and therefore it is reflected graphically as an increase of as a shift to the right of the demand for money. Nominally, what that means is, right, for instance, let's consider this blue line here, and Y rises from Y1 to Y2. How should you think about an increase in the demand for money? Well, that simply means that at the new Y, right, at the new Y here, at the old R1, you want to hold more M over P, right? So at the old R1, instead of having the old demand, which equals M over P, you want to be able to say at that old R, you want to demand more real money balances. So if you notice, if you move to the right along the dotted line here, it will touch the new red line here. And what's important to notice this spot here is actually a higher M over P relative to before. No? So your real money balances demand is higher for any given real interest rate. So that means it's a shift to the right. Right? You want to hold more real money for any given level of R, which is the cost of holding money. All right, so you have L now as a function not just of R, but of Y. And then Y here will shift the demand for money. And an increase in Y will shift the demand for money to the right. And a decrease in Y will shift it to the left. Okay. So this alone is enough to have this connection between R and Y, which we will call the LM curve. So in this case, if, for instance, for any given R, your Y rises, what will happen to your R to balance the market for real money balances? Well, like we said, if Y goes up, right? If Y goes from Y1 to Y2, it has to be that R has to go up because according to this panel A or picture A, if the demand for money shifts to the right, the only way for the market to return to equilibrium is for the real interest rate to rise from R1 to R2, right? So therefore, a higher income from Y1 to Y2 will lead to a higher real interest rate R1 to R2. And that's depicted here in the LM curve. So the Y and R, they're positively related, right? The higher the Y is, the higher the R is. Okay. So that's the LM curve, right? And to book to to end the chapter, I was thinking of a very very specific book related pun. So how monetary policy sorry shifts the LM curve, right? Similarly to what we did in the IS curve, where fiscal policy or anything really that shifts the PE or planned expenditure will tend to shift the IS curve. Monetary policy will here shift the LM curve, right? So the LM curve tells us the interest rate that equilibrates the money market at any level of income. Yet, as we saw earlier, the equilibrium interest rate also depends on the supply of real money balances M over P. That means the LM curve is drawn for a given supply of real money balances. If the real money balances changes, it will shift the LM curve, right? So before we go to the picture below, we'll go to this earlier picture here, right? This picture has already shown, for instance, right? What's going to happen, right? So if M falls because of a contractionary monetary policy, the money supply falls, again, P is fixed, that will tend to raise R, right? Raise R. Okay. That means for any given Y, R will tend to be higher if you have a reduction in monetary policy. So if you look back at uh, well, I guess we can go here directly. If it moves to the left here, R will be higher, so that at any given Y, R will be higher. Take a look at the old LM curve here. For this Y, R is higher. For pick any random Y, for any Y, R will be higher. For this Y, R will be higher. And therefore, you can consider this as a shift up or to a shift left of the LM curve, right? A decrease or a shrinking of the money supply by the central bank will tend to shift to the left of the LM curve here. Okay. So this is a particularly important graph. So like the IS curve before it, it would be a good idea if you're at all confused about the direction in which the LM curve will shift, first work it out through the market for real money balances. So again, what's happening here is if you notice, if M goes down, R will go up, and that's for a given Y. So that's why for any given Y, R will go up. And that's how you know the direction in which the LM curve will shift. It will shift up because R will rise for any given Y. So now we have two curves, the IS curve and the LM curve. If you notice, both of them are functions of Y and R. They're both Y and R are so-called endogenous variables. And down here in the LM curve, you also have R and Y here, right? And they're both coming in from the demand side, the demand for liquidity here, or demand for money. And that's equated to the supply of money on the other side. Okay. So now that we have two equations in the two same unknowns, the two unknowns are R and Y, then we can graph them together in the same way that you can graph demand and supply curves, right? And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next chapter. We're going to typically just graph the IS and LM curve together, and then we're going to do experiments in this economy. We will shift the IS curve to the right and shift the LM curve to the right or to the left and so on and so forth. Before we even continue with that, it's important to think about why this is a macro model at all, right? So it's a macro model, guys, because take a look at the interpretations for the two equations here. So this is for the entire economy. The IS curve is all about the equality of Y and C plus I plus G. So that alone tells you that this is the macro or national market for GDP, right? Which is Y equals C plus I plus G, of course, in a closed economy. So these are combinations of R and Y that will make Y equals C plus I plus G true, right? And then below, so if this is the market for goods and services, which is all of the goods and all of the services, right? So below, you have the demand for transactions liquidity here, or for demand for money. So the second main market here is the demand for money, which is about the supply on the left-hand side equaling the demand for money on the right-hand side. So this is a macro model because literally it's really about the macro economy. The IS curve is about the market for goods and services for the entire macro economy. And the LM curve is about the demand for money for residents belonging to that economy, right? And both of them together, once both of them clear at the same time, then that means the entire macro economy is in the short-run equilibrium. Okay, so that's it. I'll see you guys on Thursday. Bye-bye.